Macroeconomic Basics. Just about every introductory macroeconomics textbook begins by asking the basic question about what is macroeconomics, and so we too shall launch our journey on that question. Before launching this video, it is strongly recommended that you read Chapter 1 in the textbook. This lecture introduces you to the what, who, why, and how of macroeconomics. You will learn about topics studied in macroeconomics. The role of John Maynard Keynes. Why macroeconomics is important. How economists study macro issues. The basic goals for an economy. The key economic statistics in macroeconomics. How fiscal policy differs from monetary policy. How theories and models help to provide insight. The key macroeconomic theories embraced, over time, to understand the economy. Let's begin the questions and answers. What is macroeconomics? First, recognize that macro refers to the aggregate or the big picture. Macroeconomics studies topics such as how the economy operates, employment and unemployment, inflation, commodity and asset markets, output and productivity, money, banking, and the financial markets, interest rates and monetary policy, government spending and fiscal policy, and international trade and exchange rates. Okay, now that we know what the subject looks at. Who is credited with launching macroeconomics? John Maynard Keynes, a British economist who lived between June 5, 1883 and April 21, 1946, is considered the father of macroeconomics. Keynes re-envisioned how the economy operated in his 1936 book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, and, in turn, rejected many of the foundations of the classical school's teaching, which dominated the thinking of the time. Keynes opined in his preface to the 1939 French edition of this book, "I have called my theory a general theory. I mean by this that I am chiefly concerned with the behavior of the economic system as a whole, with aggregate incomes, aggregate profits, aggregate output, aggregate employment, aggregate investment, aggregate saving rather than with the incomes, profits, output, employment, investment and saving of particular industries, firms, or individuals." Who is credited with coining the word macroeconomics? Surprisingly, maybe, Keynes did not coin the word macroeconomics to describe his new theories. In a 1933 paper on business cycles, Norwegian economist Ragnar Frisch, who lived between 1895 and 1973, and would later jointly receive the first Nobel Prize for Economics in 1969, was the first to coin the words microeconomics, to refer to the study of single firms and industries, and macroeconomics, to refer to the study of the aggregate economy. Frisch wrote, "When we approach the study of the business cycle with the intention of carrying through an analysis that is truly dynamic and determinate, we are naturally led to distinguish between two types of analyses, the microdynamic and the macrodynamic types." He went on to say, "The macrodynamic analysis tries to give an account of the fluctuations of the whole economic system, taken in its entirety." Why do we study macroeconomics? Listen to this quote and think about who may have said this and when. Here goes the quote. "The American people have of late been more conscious of the business cycle, more sensitive to every wrinkle of economic curves, more alert to the possible need for contracyclical action on the part of government, than ever before in history. Minor changes of employment or of productivity or of the price level, which in an earlier generation would have gone unnoticed, are nowadays followed closely by laymen as well as experts." Unquote. Indeed, we all follow the economy daily in the news and are very much aware of the ups and downs in the economy. So, do you have any thoughts about the who and when of this quote? Those were the words of Arthur Burns, who was a college professor at Columbia University, once the president of the National Bureau of Economic Research, the chairman of President Eisenhower's Council of Economic Advisers, a former chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, and U.S. ambassador to Germany. Burns spoke those words in his presidential address to the American Economic Association in 1959. I would say, if that was true more than 60 years ago, it is certainly more accurate today. So, there are lots of reasons to study macroeconomics to provide insight into how the economy operates, and to understand and to guide how policymakers attempt to improve the functioning of the economy. Next, let's consider the question, how do economists study the macroeconomy? There are 5 steps in the process. Step 1, look around and observe the world. This is a starting point to analyze the macroeconomic data for growth patterns, trends, and possible relationships with other data, as well as any other data characteristic that may help to understand how the economy operates. It is an empirical step. Step 2, theorize. Macroeconomists suggest how the economy may work by hypothesizing an economic theory, which is a logical framework to explain a particular economic phenomenon. Step 3, develop models. Economic theory involves developing an economic model, which is a simplified representation of the economic phenomenon. The model may be described in a verbal, mathematical or graphical form. Step 4, quantify relationships with statistical estimates. Econometric methods, which are statistical estimation tools, can quantify economic impacts through estimation of the model parameters. Step 5, evaluate. Not every theory or model will be proved correct or relevant, so an evaluation is needed. That assessment can be how well the theory or model explains the economic behavior, or how well does it forecasts an economic behavior. Okay, now that we have discussed the how and why of macroeconomics, we need to define the what. This question is, what are the key concepts in macroeconomics? The core focus of macroeconomics is oriented towards 3 basic data concepts. 1. Employment, and the unemployment rate. 2. The inflation rate, and 3. Real GDP, which is output, or productivity, which is output per input. Let's look at these key macroeconomic measures further. The unemployment rate is defined as the number of unemployed people divided by the labor force. These data are reported by the U.S. Labor Department and are derived based on a monthly survey. The inflation rate, however, could be measured by a host of possible statistics. We shall see that different policymakers and different government agencies use different measures to track inflation. But conceptually, at least, there is a common thread. A price index, such as the Consumer Price Index or CPI, measures the price level and is a snapshot relative to some base period. If you look at the rate of change in that price index, then you are looking at inflation. Output, or productivity are the third key measures. If you think about an aggregate production function where output or production is determined by the inputs, such as labor, capital, and technology, this relationship shows both sides of the third key statistic group. Output focuses just on the production, while productivity focuses on output relative to the inputs. Productivity describes the economy's ability to get more output from a given amount of inputs. Although these data are no longer updated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, an estimate, for example, of the average worker's productivity per hour worked in 2018 was just over $63 per worker. So why are those big 3 data concepts so important for macroeconomics? Well, the answer is simply that it can be generally agreed upon that it is a desirable goal for the economy to see strong economic growth, a low unemployment rate, and low inflation. Although these are admirable goals for an economy, what do we mean by strong growth, low inflation, and low unemployment? Only by examining the historical trends for these measures can we really say what is strong, weak, high, or low. This is why you need to look at economic data. You might be wondering, why are interest rates not considered among the key concepts in macroeconomics? The answer is relatively simple. Interest rates are extremely important to the performance of the economy and are built into all major macroeconomic theories, but interest rates can remain low only in a stable macroeconomic environment, so the level of the interest rate is a consequence of other economic forces in the economy even though it is a policy tool. Think about it, what are some of the challenges to achieve those macroeconomic goals? Although it is easy to qualitatively be for strong growth and low unemployment, some of the challenges to achieve those goals are: 1. Defining what is meant by strong and what is low. Strong growth is relative to a country's trends, demographics, and generally the country's potential. Low inflation also is relative to a country's trends. Similarly, a low unemployment rate is highly dependent on demographic trends, and at times the labor markets may, or may not, be able to absorb an influx of new entrants fully and rapidly. 2. Determining which economic theory among competing theories offers the best policy and insights to reach those goals. And 3. Balancing value judgments or normative views among policymakers in the selection of any policy path. We have mentioned macroeconomic theories to help achieve the economy's goals, but precisely what is a macroeconomic theory? Now that we have some goals for the economy, we need to have some pathway, or plan, to achieve those goals. This pathway is macroeconomic theory, which is a set of ideas and principles that attempt to depict the workings of the economy based on what is perceived to be the primary drivers or factors affecting how the economy operates. Theories are developed to aid in the interpretation of economic activity, to provide explanations, and to offer solutions to economic problems. The next logical question, therefore, is what is the focus of macroeconomic theory? The Congressional Research Service described the main focus of macroeconomic theory as having twofold missions to address both the short-term and long-term performance of the economy. In its words, traditional macroeconomic theory addresses two main questions. First, macroeconomic theory and policies seek to mitigate short-term economic fluctuations or stabilize the economy that leave productive resources idle for a time. Second, macroeconomists seek to recommend public policies that maximize living standards, that is economic growth, over the long term, while keeping debt at sustainable levels. The role of monetary policy, and the maintenance of a stable price level, are embedded in both issues. More specifically, some of the key consensus takeaways from macroeconomic theory can be summarized as follows. 1. What is produced and consumed in the economy is determined jointly by the economy's productive capacity and the preferences of final demand. 2. In free market economies, strong forces tend to produce socially efficient economic outcomes. 3. Unemployment is painful for individuals, but it is inevitable in modern economies. 4. Improvements in a country's standard of living are brought about in the long run by technological progress. 5. A tax cut is not a free lunch. 6. Credit markets and financial institutions, such as banks and investment houses, play key roles in the macroeconomy. 7. What consumers and firms anticipate for the future has an important bearing on current macroeconomic events. This seems to be a very old idea. In 360 BC, the Greek philosopher Plato wrote that, quote, "Each man possesses opinions about the future, which go by the general name of expectations." Unquote. And those expectations display a close correspondence with trends in the official data series produced by the federal statistical agencies, as opined by the University of Michigan's Survey Research Center. 8. Wealth takes many forms, and a nation is much better off with it than without it. 9. Business cycles are similar, but they can have many causes. 10. Countries gain from trading goods and assets with each other, but trade is also a source of shocks to the domestic economy. 11. In the long run, inflation is caused by growth in the money supply. We will return to these points in more depth throughout this course. Now, it is worth noting that not all economists agree on what are the main catalysts and channels for economic growth, inflation, and unemployment in an economy. Although there is a common accepted core of macroeconomics, views have evolved as to how the economy operates, as the economy itself evolves. This leads us to ask, what are the main schools of macroeconomic theory? The key schools of thought influencing macroeconomic thinking include the classical school, the Keynesian school, monetarism, the New Classical School, the Austrian School, and the Modern Monetary Theory School. Let's discuss each of these briefly. The classical school of thought. The classical school of economics generally referred to itself as the study of the political economy. It did not distinguish between microeconomics and macroeconomics as we do today, but its theories built upon work of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Jean-Baptiste Say, Robert Malthus, John Stuart Mill, and others. Some of the concepts promulgated by the classical school are integrated into our macroeconomic perspective, if for no other reason than as a comparison to later macroeconomic thinking. One of the tenets of this thinking was flexible wages and prices, which is generally rejected today based on empirical evidence and theoretical challenges. The Keynesian school of thought. This is the approach originated by John Maynard Keynes and expanded upon by numerous economists, including Sir John Hicks, Lawrence Klein, Franco Modigliani, Paul Samuelson, Robert Solow, and James Tobin. Princeton University professor Alan Blinder observed that there are 6 basic tenets of Keynesian economics. 1. A Keynesian believes that aggregate demand is influenced by a host of economic decisions, both public and private, and sometimes behaves erratically. 2. According to Keynesian theory, changes in aggregate demand, whether anticipated or unanticipated, have their greatest short-run effect on real output and employment, not on prices. 3. Keynesians believe that prices, and especially wages, respond slowly to changes in supply and demand, resulting in periodic shortages and surpluses, especially of labor. 4. Keynesians do not think that the typical level of unemployment is ideal, partly because unemployment is subject to the caprice of aggregate demand, and partly because they believe that prices adjust only gradually. 5. Many, but not all, Keynesians advocate activist stabilization policy to reduce the amplitude of the business cycle, which they rank among the most important of all economic problems. 6. Finally, and even less unanimously, some Keynesians are more concerned about combating unemployment than about conquering inflation. Monetarism. The monetarist school was initially based on the quantity theory of money, which uses the equation of exchange, which is denoted as MV equals PQ, where M is the money supply, V is the velocity of money, P is the price level, and Q is real output, and PQ also equals nominal GDP. From that equation of exchange, a monetary theory was built based on assumptions of the stability of velocity, which empirically is not the case anymore if it ever was, and the quantity, Q, is also invariant, that is, fixed. For velocity, V, it was assumed that it was fixed, or relatively so, because it was dependent on the population, amount of trade, habits of people to hold money, and the type of financial system in place, all factors that were assumed to be unrelated to the value of money. Similarly, the quantity, that is, Q or real GDP, also was assumed to be dependent on factors that are unrelated to the value of money, including factors such as the abundance of natural resources in the country, methods of production, skills of labor, and the country's infrastructure. Therefore, this showed that money and the price level were directly related. From that beginning, the monetarist school evolved to the view that supply of money was the cause of inflation and/or economic activity. It has evolved since its heyday in the 1960s and 1970s into advocating rule-based growth in the money supply or interest rates, which has become part of today's new classical and new monetary consensus approaches. Some people that were instrumental to the monetarist movement in the 1960s were University of Chicago professor Milton Friedman, University of Rochester professor Carl Brunner, and Carnegie Mellon professor Alan Meltzer. One of the lasting views of this perspective is that in the long run, changes in the quantity of money lead to proportional changes in the price level over the long run. New Classical School or New Monetary Consensus. The New, or Neo, Classical School, also sharing similar ideas with the real business cycle or rational expectations approach, and the new Keynesian school attempts to integrate microeconomics fundamentals into its macroeconomics theory. This school of thought originated with the work of Robert Lucas, and was expanded upon by Thomas Sargent, Neil Wallace, and others, and has morphed into what some economists refer to as the new monetary consensus. New classical economists believe that individuals opt for the best choices available given prices and wages, to move quantities supplied equal to quantities demanded, that is, to an equilibrium, without the need for discretionary fiscal policies, and that monetary policy can control inflation. As such, early work on this theory only argued for policy adjustments by monetary authorities, but after the 2008 global financial crisis, some proponents accepted the need for some fiscal policy to complement monetary policy, but these policies largely focus on longer-run aggregate supply-side factors. Despite the recognition of the need for some fiscal policy at times, this economic perspective largely places the stabilization role with monetary policy using some type of rule for setting interest rates, such as the Taylor rule, which will be discussed later. If aggregate demand is too high and creates elevated inflation expectations, the central bank needs to increase interest rates and vice versa. The main channel through which this theory works is by controlling expectations. Austrian school. The Austrian school of macroeconomics largely focuses on capital and business cycle theory, and tends to embrace a free market solution to an aggregate supply and aggregate demand equilibrium. Absent fiscal and monetary policy attempts to stabilize the business cycle, the Austrian school argues that the economy ultimately will find its equilibrium without any misallocation of resources. This perspective also embraces the monetarist Milton Friedman's view that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Economists behind this school include Karl Menger, Eugene Bohm-Bawerk, and Ludwig von Mises. Finally, the modern monetary theory. The modern monetary theory, or MMT, is based on a view that sovereign nation that issues its own currency cannot be forced into default on debt it issued, which is denominated in its own currency, since the country can always create more money to pay its debt. This perspective, developed in the 1990s, has been described as descriptive, and separated from policies advocated by MMT's proponents. On the descriptive side, Professor Stephanie Kelton said that, quote, "To describe the modern monetary theory, MMT, project in a single sentence, I would say it is about replacing an artificial, federal deficit constraint, with an inflation constraint. So there are limits to government deficit spending. But the limit is not a predetermined numerical level or a percentage of the budget. There is no strict financial constraint. A currency issuing government can afford to buy whatever is priced and available for sale in its own currency. The limit, to spending, however, is not the spending itself, and not the deficit, but the limit is inflation. That is central to MMT." Unquote. Randall Wray, Warren Mosseler, Bill Mitchell, Stephanie Kelton, and Scott Fulwiler are among the developers of this perspective. Let's take stock of where we are. We defined the subject matter, and provided the window on the key concepts and goals of macroeconomics, and then we defined, and provided an overview of key macroeconomic theories. But the operational perspective is the packaging of those concepts and goals into a paradigm to understand the interaction of the three key concepts in macroeconomics: growth, inflation, and unemployment. This leads us to the next question: what are some paradigms that are used to understand macroeconomic dynamics? The two basic paradigms that are used today are the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, and the three-equation model. Although we will not say much about the three-equation model, it is important that you know about it conceptually. The aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, which is derived from the IS and LM model, which is the model of the equilibrium between the commodity markets and liquidity or money markets, is a gap model. By gap model, we mean, there is actual data and a goal for the economy. Then the framework allows one to conceptualize how far the economy is from its potential. As noted in the reader notes of the textbook, to paraphrase a widely held sentiment in economics that was stated in a 1988 article by Princeton University economist Ben Bernanke, who would later become a Federal Reserve Board chair, and Alan Blinder, who later was a Federal Reserve Board vice chair, the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, which is a foundational paradigm for macroeconomics, is not interpreted literally, nor does anyone think it is directly suitable for econometric estimation, but it is useful for telling simple, yet coherent, stories about the transmission of monetary, fiscal, and other shocks through the economy. We will delve into the mechanics of that model later in this course. The second paradigm, which is the three-equation model, is an offshoot of the IS and LM model, as well. However, it recognizes that short-term interest rates are set by the central bank, and not exclusively determined by the supply and demand for loanable funds, and adjusts the IS and LM accordingly using a monetary policy rule for setting interest rates. Additionally, it incorporates a trade-off between wages and the unemployment rate, which empirically may be a weak relationship today, but is conceptually built into this, and the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. This model has been widely embraced by central banks. Again, we will use the aggregate demand and aggregate supply framework for most of our future discussions since it largely captures the core conceptual approach, how the economy works. Later you also will encounter some recent research and empirical data that distinguishes business cycles, based on whether the cycle is principally driven by aggregate demand or aggregate supply. But this discussion will have to wait until we cover more fundamentals about the data that drives each. By now, you should have a sense about the areas of research that macroeconomics examines. But, to formalize that notion, let's look at what areas of research that macroeconomics is concerned about. The answer to this question is that there are numerous topics of concern, including economic growth, business cycles, inflation, unemployment, interest rates, taxes, trade issues, financial markets, and more. Can you add any more topics to the list? What are the main policy tools used to guide the economy? The main policy tools are fiscal and monetary. Fiscal policy is a course of action by a central government in support of the nation's economic goals. Monetary policy, on the other hand, is a course of action by the nation's central bank in support of the nation's economic goals. How does fiscal policy differ from monetary policy? The fiscal approach sets the nation's tax policy, and in turn, federal government revenue, and determines the amount of federal government spending, and on which priorities. The monetary approach, however, sets interest rate policy consistent with its objectives of the amount of liquidity needed in the economy and in recent years, if needed, has provided direct lending facilities to various segments of the economy. In a book by Princeton University professor Alan Blinder, he tells a story that President Kennedy could not keep these policies straight until it was pointed out to him that William McChesney Martin Jr., who was the chair of the Federal Reserve Board at the time, actually he served from 1951 to 1970, had a last name that began with M, and so too did the word monetary. Today, that mnemonic for remembering the difference between fiscal and monetary policies would not work, but maybe a better mnemonic might be to think that fiscal policy requires a fight in Congress. Then the words fiscal and fight both begin with F. From their own perspectives and governmental charge, both fiscal and monetary policy are concerned with stabilization policy. But, what is meant by stabilization policy? A stabilization policy is any governmental or central bank policy that seeks to influence the level of aggregate demand towards its long-run goals for the economy by minimizing business cycle fluctuations. Economic approaches to stabilization policy fall into two broad camps, activist and non-activist. Activist policy will often follow from macro theories, such as the Keynesian theory or the modern monetary theory, argue the economy will not correct on its own without a substantial cost, while non-activist policy, such as from classical theories or the Austrian school, argue the economy will correct on its own because of self-correcting mechanisms in the economic system. Now, let's consider the question: how does fiscal policy impact the economy? Fiscal policy can affect aggregate demand and/or aggregate supply. Typically, Fiscal policy is thought of as a tool to primarily stimulate aggregate demand. However, fiscal policy also has numerous channels through the supply side, affecting production costs and productivity by way of its regulatory role in the economy. Moreover, successful fiscal policy implementation is dependent on the so-called 3 T's. These are the fiscal taxation and spending programs. 1. Targets. Who are the fiscal programs designed to help? 2. Totals. How much money must be spent to see a meaningful impact? And 3. Timing for implementation. How soon will the fiscal package take effect? In essence, therefore, fiscal policy must answer questions of what, where, how, and when in the design and implementation of any policy. What tools do fiscal policymakers have available? Generically, economists refer to fiscal policy as federal government taxation and expenditures. But practically, there are a lot more fiscal policy tools than just that. The list is long, and in addition to tax rates and spending, include what items are subject to taxes, government subsidies, stimulus checks, such as economic impact payments, tax credits, direct government investment on projects where market failure leads to underinvestment, labor market policies affecting training and education, minimum wage, foreign worker quotas, government regulations, such as financial market regulations, environmental protection regulations, public natural or natural resource use, labor safety regulations, product safety regulations, permits, international trade policies, such as international tariffs, controls on trade, quotas or restricting trade in certain products, public ownership of factors of production, such as energy reserves and public land holdings, value of country's currency, exchange rate policies, price and wage controls, rationing, compelling private sector production, such as invoked in the U.S. under the Defense Production Act during wars and national emergencies. It was used in 2020 for personal protective product production. So the shorthand reference that most intro books make to fiscal policy, as just being taxation and spending, is misleading, since the federal government has a plethora of tools under those monikers. Now let's explore the second channel for economic policy, which is monetary policy. Let's first ask the question, how does monetary policy impact the economy? The answer is that monetary policy can affect aggregate demand and/or aggregate supply. Typically, monetary policy is thought of as a tool to primarily impact aggregate demand through higher or lower borrowing costs for the purchase, on credit, of such items as vehicles, houses, plant and equipment, and more. However, monetary policy also may affect aggregate supply, since interest payments are a cost of production, which impacts aggregate supply, and the central bank policymakers also use their speeches and announcements to influence business and financial market expectations about interest rates, inflation, and economic growth, which impacts both aggregate demand and aggregate supply. With an understanding of the how of monetary policy, the next question to consider is, what tools do monetary policymakers have available? Generically, economists think of monetary policy as changes in the central bank's policy interest rate, which is the federal funds rate in the United States. However, there are a host of specific monetary policy instruments that policymakers use, and different central banks around the world may have slightly different sets of policy tools at their disposal. These monetary policy tools include the traditional interest rate or money supply adjustments, direct lending facilities to provide liquidity at times, and quantitative easing and tightening. We will learn more about these tools later when we discuss monetary policy in depth. Economists are fond of using models, but why do economists use models? United Kingdom economist Joan Robinson described the use of models in economics as a roadmap. Maps simplify our complex world to small-scale, flat figures. When used for traveling, A map can show us the route we need to follow, abstracting from a host of information that is not essential to reach the destination. The map might be different, and more or less stylized, depending on the means of transportation. Think of your favorite bicycle, foot, train, bus or car maps. In the same way, economic models might be different depending on the structure and characteristics of the economy, policy instruments available, institutional constraints, etc. Finally, let's discuss what is meant by storytelling in macroeconomics. Economists use economic data patterns and stories to explain economic situations, such as a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, a recession, a financial crisis, or just about any economic motivation and more. The approach in this course will rely heavily on this storytelling approach, known, more formally, as the literary approach. As noted in the book's preface, stories matter especially in introductions to macroeconomics. No one expects a novice to the field to understand the mathematical formulations of theories, or the econometric estimations of issues, without first understanding the economic stories and patterns of the data. As I was completing this book, an opinion piece by Gillian Tett appeared in the Financial Times on August 26, 2022, which was entitled, "Economists Should Not Underestimate the Power of a Good Story." Indeed. You have now completed the first topic on macroeconomic basics. You will revisit some of these topics in greater depth and build upon them in future lectures and chapters of the book. But for now, you have gotten your feet wet in the subject. Before moving ahead, you may want to consider the issues to think about section, which you also will find in each chapter of the textbook. As an online environment, you might use any communication tools for your online course to share your thoughts on these issues with your fellow classmates, if you are so inclined. But if not, please take a moment anyway to think about how you would answer these questions, which largely will not have a right or wrong answer.